last several weeks, we've been talking about rebooting our faith, and we've come to the realization that, of course, everything in life has a starting point. I had a starting point. You had a starting point. Some of you actually were started on purpose. And some of us maybe were not. And I didn't want to mention this when I first brought this up a few weeks ago because my mom was in the audience and I didn't want to embarrass her. But how many of you are here this morning that are an oops, okay, your mom and dad were enough to admit to you that they love you to death and they're glad you're here, but I'm in that category. Had an older brother, older sister, and 5 years later. But the greatest blessings in life are surprises. Isn't that right? Amen? Yeah, that's right. So we're glad that you're here. I'm glad to be here. Glad that you're here. God is glad you're here. It might have been a mistake to some, but it wasn't to God. He wanted you here. And we're glad that you're here. But everything has a starting point. And even our faith. And we don't think about that very much, about faith having a starting point. And as we've mentioned before, for many of us, maybe not all of us, but for the majority of us, that journey of faith or that starting of faith happens sometime in your childhood. Either your parents, you overheard them talking about God, or maybe you saw some folks having prayer, or maybe it was in a class, a Sunday school class, or maybe in a vacation Bible school, or at a camp, or a neighbor, that was, one of those real religious types, and they just talked about Jesus all the time. But anyway, there was that first idea that this world that we lived in, it just couldn't be, just couldn't happen, and you became to have this belief in God, and so there began to develop in your life this childlike foundation of faith. And that's a good thing. As a child, you have to begin with a childlike foundation. But as you got older, then you began to experience life and things began to happen. Maybe it was in a classroom, maybe in high school, and for the first time you were inundated with neo-Darwinism and the idea that this world came out of chaos and that life came from non-life and that matter was eternal and we're all here just because we were the fittest to survive. And all of a sudden, these smart professors, and you got into college, they begin to question things, and all of a sudden that childlike faith that seemed to have all the answers began to crumble a little bit. And then life began to happen, and things began to happen that didn't seem congruent with a good God. If there's a good God, why do so many bad things happen, and nobody's giving you the good answers to those things? And so you begin to struggle internally, and it's not that you were mad at God, and it's not that you chose to not believe, but it's like that childlike faith was left in the rearview mirror of your life, and you moved on. But then life begins to happen, and maybe it's around Christmas and Easter, and all of a sudden you're thinking about God things again, and I wonder if it's true. I feel this emptiness in my life, this lack of purpose and direction, or maybe a loved one dies, and you begin to question about whether their life had any significance. And if there's any purpose to us being here, or if you're a young adult, maybe you have your first child, and all of a sudden you begin to get interested, and you begin to ask the question, is there any truth to those things that we believed and were taught as small children? And so you begin to think about reevaluating the things of faith. Now, what we've done in this series is we've kind of tried to capture the idea, what if we went back and just cleaned the slate and looked at, our faith again, but this time from an adult point of view. Nothing wrong with a child foundation, but our faith didn't mature as we did mature. But how would we go back and reboot? And we discovered a couple things. One is you go back to the scriptures and you look at the people that came to have faith, especially those of a non-Jewish background that had no idea of God, the biblical God, and of Jesus Christ. You'll never find the Apostle Paul or Peter, some of these early preachers coming and saying, well, the Bible says. That's not demeaning the Bible. I believe in, and I'm not asking that you have to believe this, but I believe in the inerrancy of the scriptures. I believe that it was inspired from Genesis to Revelation. I believe it's God speaking to us, but even believing that I don't think, Paul didn't come and say, well, you got to believe this because the Bible. That's not a frame of reference where you begin as an adult. And so we begin to ask some questions on how we should look at our faith. And how did it begin? Well, first of all, you need to realize this, that the story of faith, it does have a starting point. Every faith tradition, regardless of whatever it might be, it had a starting point. Now, a lot of times we're not really interested in the history of a starting point of faith. You know, we don't care who started it. We don't care when it started. All we know is that, it's Thursday and I've got a test tomorrow and I've been praying to God since Monday. I've not been able to study. I've been busy. The coaches have been making me go these crazy hours, in the batting cage or whatever. And I've been praying to God and I've just not heard anything from God. And it's this thing real? And you begin to wonder, is God real? Is it possible that we as these small, finite beings in this vast universe that blows our mind, that's ever expanding, can we as human beings connect with an infinite God? Can He bring me peace? Can I really have a relationship with Him? I need to know if you're there, God. And that's probably the reason some of you might have drifted away from the foundation of your childhood faith, because you didn't understand the foundation to begin with. That goes beyond whether God answers prayer the way that we want Him to. That goes beyond whether things always go good in my life. As we begin to talk about this foundation of faith, first of all, we need to understand this, is that the three largest faith traditions, they claim the same starting point. By and large, the vast majority of people that have a concept of God comes from either Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. And all three of those claim the same starting point. First of all, they all believe that there's just one God. They all believe that this one God created the universe. And they all believe that God chose to create the first human being and He gave him the name Adam. They all believe that. And they also all believe that this human race of people that started with Adam and this woman named Eve, is that these people really messed things up. And so God had a choice. Either to say, it's not my mess, I'm walking away from it, or I'm going to wade into it and do something about it. Well, the starting point of all these three faith traditions is this: Abraham. Abraham. A guy that lived 2,000 years before Jesus came. So Abraham lives about as far on that side of the cross as we do on this side of the cross, just to give you just a little bit of an idea of how long ago. But every one of these three major faith groups merge at this guy, Abraham. And it's kind of interesting that all three of these faith traditions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, this is where they all separate. So we find a conversation recorded way back in a book called the Book of Genesis. And if you're not familiar with the books of the Bible and why they got their name, the Genesis is the beginning, is what it means. And it's the first book of the Bible. It was written by a guy named Moses. You've heard of Moses. You've seen the Ten Commandments. And God inspired him to write the book of Genesis, hundreds of years after it took place. And so what Moses does is he records for us a conversation that God had with this guy, Abraham, that kind of brings all things together, where God chooses to wade in. And all three of these faith traditions believe that God chose not to walk away from His creation, which He created as good, that we messed up, but God chose to meet it dead on with a guy named Abraham, where He now is going to begin to clean up this mess that we've made. And it's through this guy, Abraham. Why would He do this? Why would He connect with this guy named Abraham? I want to tell you a true story. And to give you just a kind of a context as to why God would do this. Years ago, when my children were in high school, my son's junior year, he doesn't know I'm telling this story. My son's junior year, his best friend invited him to go to Port St. Joe on spring break. And I was somewhat hesitant about that. This guy, this friend of his, who's, by the way, in the ministry, he said his dad would be there, his biological father, and my wife and I, Lynn, we talked about it for some time. I grew up about 45 minutes from Daytona Beach. I'm not stupid on what happens on spring breaks, okay? You know, I've seen it firsthand. I've been on the beach during spring break. And so I know what, so I had some hesitation. And my wife and I thought, well, you know, I don't know. And of course, my son's response to me is one that you've probably heard before. Dad, don't you trust me? And my response to him, and he could probably quote this for you because I've done it several times, is, son, I trust your intentions, but I don't completely trust your hormones. And but we talked about it. We decided, okay, let him go, but we're not going to, not a whole week. So he went over on a Wednesday, met his friend over there, and he swore allegiance to moral purity and all that, you know, before we let him go. And so with fear and trepidation, we let him go for a few days. Well, come Thursday night, we get a phone call, midnight. And it's my son. Oh, Dad, I'm sick. I'm throwing up. Red flags begin to go up. I said, Josh, now you tell me the truth. You've been drinking? Now, if you lie to me, it's going to be a whole lot worse than if you just tell me, what have you been doing? What have you been up to? And he swore up and down. He goes, I ate some, we went into a pizza place, and I think of something bad that we eat, and I've been throwing up about every 15 minutes. And how long has it been going on? A couple of hours, and I really don't feel good. I said, well, son, you know good and well, I didn't want you to go to begin with. That's 2 hours away. It's midnight. It's going to be 2 o'clock in the morning before we get there. By the time we pick you up and head back, it's going to be 4:30 in the morning. You've made your mess. You just have to gut it out. Suck it up. Be a man. Y'all don't believe that I did that, do you? The amazing thing, though, is that many of you that know me and knows that I would never, abandon my children, my son or my daughter. Some of you, though, have the mindset that God created this world, left a mess that we made, and God says, I don't want to have anything else to do with it. And it's going off onto some other part of the universe. So what you're saying is that I'm more righteous than God is. And in my book, that's blasphemy. And so I think maybe you need to recalibrate your mind about God and who God is and how much of a desire He has to help us in our times of need and in the mess that we've made with our lives. And I know that as we look around in the world, we see so much injustice, and we see so many bad things that are happening in the world. But as bad as things are, imagining living in a world like Abraham did, where they didn't have really any national government or city governments, and there was no definite laws. I mean, we're talking about when God was talking to Abraham, we're talking hundreds of years before the Ten Commandments and the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. We're talking, 2,600 years before Islam, and a couple thousand years before Christ even. So we're talking about a culture where there were no government authorities to maintain. I mean, the idea of slavery in Abraham's time was never given a second thought, never questioned as far as a moral issue. If a lot of times people sold themselves into slavery, or if you were captured in battle, that was a part of the spoils, that somebody came and did the things for you, the dirty work that you didn't want to do. If you saw somebody that, maybe a child that you wanted, it was survival of the fittest and the strongest. If you had enough men, you went and took whatever you wanted. Women, children, whatever. That's the world that Abraham is living in. And God could have said, well, there you go. I created a good world. What'd you do? You messed it up. Call me when you get it all cleaned up. But that's not what God did. God could have just hung an out of order sign on our world and said, I'll come back when you straighten it up. But that's not the kind of God we have. All three of the major religions believe that God decided to come back, to wade into the mess of humanity. And he chose to do that through a single man named Abraham. That's where it started. It's where he took a normal guy. And that's the amazing thing. Abraham wasn't this really super, it wasn't like Abraham was so holy and perfect that God said, okay, this is the guy. As a matter of fact, you read the scriptures, he was so normal. There was an occasion that he was going by Egypt and stopped by, and the Pharaoh saw his wife Sarah. And the Pharaoh said, wow, man, she is smoking hot. And so he goes to Abraham and said, Abraham, tell me about this woman, this gorgeous woman. And Abraham's thinking in his mind, this culture, he likes my wife, so he's going to take my life. And so he says, hey, she's my sister. You're talking about people struggling with, commitment issues. Abraham's like, here, take my wife, take her home. I'll get another one somewhere along the line. And then, of course, God had to intervene, and some crazy dreams. Pharaoh came back and said, Abraham, what's going on here? And Abraham had to confess. He lied. He had an issue with telling lies. But God picks this imperfect Abraham, and this is what he says to him. And the Lord said to Abram, which is kind of his name, and it kind of developed into Abraham. And the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, which was Ur of Chaldees. It was kind of where Baghdad in that area today. And he goes, I want you to go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I'm going to show you. Now, Ur of Chaldees back in the ancient times, it was the metropolis, pretty much. It was very contemporary as far as in their culture. And God's coming to Abraham. He said, look, I want you to leave everything. Leave your parents' household, the security of family. I want you to leave everything behind, and I want you to go to a place that you have never been to before. And what God is saying, Abraham, I'm going to start something with you that's going to ultimately impact the whole world. And I've chosen you. I don't want you to ask me why right now. I don't want you to ask me where you're going. You just got to trust me. I just want you to go. It's got to start somewhere, and I'm going to start it with you. And then God gives Abraham 3 promises. It's very interesting. The first promise is this. He goes, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Now, today, people from an Arab background that say, well, let's talk about us. Look at us. People from the Jewish background said, no, it's talking about us. Everybody's claiming Abraham. He said, I'm going to make you into a great nation. The one thing that's not debated is that there are many nations that have come from Abraham 4,000 years ago. Now, Abraham could have said, now, God, just a second, hold on. I'm old. My wife's old. And you're going to make me a great nation. I'm old. My wife's old. We have no children. He could have done that. But he doesn't. Promise number 2 is this that God says. He goes, I'm going to bless you and I will make your name great. Let me ask you this. Let's take a quick survey. How many people, even before today, have heard of Abraham? Isn't that amazing? Let me ask you, how many have heard of this guy? Cheddar Loamer. Okay, we got 2. That's good. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you who it is. But it's interesting. Cheddar Loamer was the man in Abraham's day. He was the king of Edom. Don't try to Google it on a map. Where's Edom? You won't find it because it does not exist anymore. He was the known guy. Isn't it interesting here 4,000 years later, everybody in here, just about it, had heard of Abraham. But a couple of people very weakly said they think they've heard the name of Cheddar Loamer. So God kept his promise. Promise number 3. And then all the people of the earth will be blessed through you, will be blessed. The Arabs say, look at us. Look at the number of us that are out here. We own the oil fields. Look how blessed we are. The Jewish people, they say, well, look how blessed we are, how God has blessed our nation, how he's protected us. Look at the wealth that we have. The famous people, of Jewish lineage. We own Hollywood, And then, of course, you got the Christian people that say, well, look at the influence of Christianity in the world, the billions of people that have come to Christ. Look at the humanitarian things that Christians have done, from hospitals to orphanages to relief efforts all over this globe for millennia. We are the blessed people. The Jews would say, their thing, the Arabs their thing, us our things, but God has blessed the world through us. Now Abraham's concern is this. He's concerned about his growing wealth that he has. He's concerned that he doesn't have a child. He's so desperate he begins to pray. We do that, don't we? When we get desperate, we begin to pray. And he says, God, I don't have a child. His chief servant, Eliezer, is going to get everything. And God says this. It says, and then the word of the Lord came to him, Abram. He said, this man will not be your heir, Eliezer, but a son who is your own flesh and blood is going to be your heir. And then he took him outside, Abraham. At this point, he's like, God saying, just hang on. I've got this. I know you're old. I know you don't have any children. And I don't want to get too far into this, but it's not going to be a virgin birth, but God is going to enable old Abraham, be able to have a child, to have a son. And then he took him outside and he said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Will you throw a picture up and just dim the lights real quick for me, please? Us folks that are around the city, like Tallahassee, we've got the city lights, and I don't think we understand how that affects our being able to see some of the stars, street lights, city lights, or whatever. I grew up in a very small community, and when in the summertime, when it's dark, it is dark. And so it's almost a scene like this that God takes Abraham outside. He says, look, Abraham, look at the stars. I want you to count them. He knows that Abraham can't count these stars. It's impossible. He says, Abraham, you don't have a child. Abraham, your wife has been barren all these years. He goes, but I want you to look up at the skies. I want you to look at the stars that are up there. He said, Abraham, I'm going to make you and your lineage like the stars of heaven. Isn't that awesome? He said, Abraham, I know you've not been perfect. You made some bad choices, some dumb decisions. But I'm going to make you a great nation. And people are going to know your name from now until the end of time. And then something amazing happens, something that could be personal for you and for me and for all of us. Genesis is going to tell us something that is so phenomenal, and we often miss it. We read the story, we don't slow up enough, but it's a statement that has lasted over 4,000 years, a statement that has been made on the other side of our planet, a statement that was made in another culture, a statement that was made in another language, a statement that was made 4,000 years ago, and it's a life-changing statement that we often can overlook. And it's a statement, I think, that answers the question that many of us have in life as we're thinking about a reboot. And that question is, God, can I know you? Can I have a relationship with you? Can you have meaning, real meaning in my life? And all this was said, this statement was made before the Ten Commandments, before Islam, before the coming of Jesus. And here's that statement, verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. Abraham looked at his life, said, I have no children in my old age, and I'm going to have children like the stars of the night sky, even though I'm an old man already. Okay, God, I trust you. And what God is saying, he says, because of your faith, this trust, I'm going to give you a gift. And God says that gift is a right standing with me. Because you believed in me and trusted me, you and I are going to have a relationship together. This is the first implication in all the scriptures that a human being can have a right standing with God. And how did it happen? It happened by faith. Now the Jews would come along and say, well, the way to a right relationship with God is by being Jewish. You know, we're God's people. Even when Jesus showed up 2,000 years later, they were saying, gee, we don't need you. We're the sons and we're the daughters of Abraham. You know, we follow the laws. We participate in all of the festivals. That's how we stay right with you. And then you have many of the Arabs, the Islam that comes along and says that, that Muhammad says that the way to a right standing with Allah is that you've got to believe in His prophets, and they believe that Adam was one of the first prophets of Allah. And you've got to believe His prophets, and you've got to do deeds of righteousness. And one of these days, when you die, you'll stand before Allah, and then He'll make a decision based upon your good deeds or your bad deeds, which outweigh the other. And you won't know until the end whether you're going to be able to go to His form of paradise or not, unless you, of course, die in jihad for Allah. And then Christianity, right after the resurrection, there began arguments among many people. Some were saying, you accept Jesus, but you still got to follow all the Jewish regulations and the rules and the festivals and all that. And so there began this division within the church, and there were others that said, well, no, how can people obey the laws if they're not Jewish? And this kind of continued on until the Reformation, and people began to relook at the Scriptures. And God says, do you trust me? May seem hard to believe. Sometimes it's impossible to comprehend. Can you get to the point that you can say, I believe what you say is true? Then I will do what I promised to do. You know, it gets to a point in your life, and you can look at the evidence, and I love the study of science, and you can look at the tenets of Darwinism, you can look at the tenets of intelligent design, but there comes a point where there's a step of faith. Now, there are some people, the Darwinians, that don't want to admit that to you, but the evidence that we as believers in God use and the ones that they try to use, there comes a point where it drops off. And there are many unanswered questions with Darwinism. Where did matter come from? Well, it just existed all the time. And you criticize us because we believe in an eternal God that's always existed. The whole thing of the mutation from one species to another, which flies in the face of genetics. And we can go right on down the line to back and forth, but there comes a point when you begin to come to God and say, God, I want you to reveal yourself to me. And could your rebooting point be this? What if the rebooting point for a relationship with God is trust? One of the things that we want to be the foundation of who we are as a church is we want people that have doubts to show up. It doesn't matter to me if you completely believe everything that happened in Abraham's life. You got many questions. That's okay. It's okay if you question whether there really was an Adam and really an Eve. And it's okay if you question if there really were 10 plagues that came. It's okay. Bring your doubts. Early people did. But there does come a time when God has presented Himself to you when you have to make a choice. Either I choose to trust and to see Him work in my life or not. But wherever you're coming from a point of belief, we're glad that you're here. And there's no other place in all of the world where you'll be accepted and loved just because you trust. It's not going to happen on the ball field. It's not going to happen at work. It's not going to happen at school. But God says, just trust me. Sometimes it stretches our imagination as to what He says He's going to do. But we trust Him. A few weeks we're going to kind of bring this together on how it all ties in with Jesus Christ and how the beginning of trust is going to point to one that will come and bring redemption.